I am verifying. It still looks like it's waiting to load. I don't know if it's the time, maybe the clock on it. I don't know. Oh man. Yes, it's live now. Okay, so we need to inform those on the original that they need to go to another link. Yes.
Okay, Claude, if you are able to hear me all over again, let's take it. In any case, welcome, Claude. For those of you guys who could not hear us on YouTube, today we're having a conversation on the truth. This is another Truth to Power series, basically, the making of Paul Kagame. And who really pulls the strings. This is going to be the conversation that we are going to be having. And Claude Gatebuke, who's the executive director for the African Action Great Lakes Network, is going to be moderating this conversation. And Claude, I do believe right now that all the technical issues have been resolved, or at least in the process of getting resolved. If you are able to hear me, take it away, brother.
Thank you, Freeman, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for bearing with us. We apologize for being late. As I said earlier, for those of you watching on Facebook, obviously you're now aware that we have been hacked. But for those of you who are watching on YouTube, you're just now realizing that we're just now kicking it off. So today's conversation is not going to be stopped by the hacking. We are not going to back down. We are going to have the conversation, and today is about the making of Paul Kagame. Who is Paul Kagame? Where does he get his powers? And I am excited to introduce our guest, who is going to be a wealth of knowledge. Again, apologies for starting this conversation late, but you will not be disappointed. This is going to be a great conversation. And I wanted to introduce Madhav Narayan, who is the co-founder of the Intrepid Citizen. Madhav, welcome to the show. Welcome to this broadcast.
Thanks
And
so much.
as you get started, I want you to also, as you start, let's get right into the conversation on who is Paul Kagame? Why is Africa important? And kind of, break this down to this audience. We've talked a lot about who Kagame is previously in other broadcasts, but there's so much more to him, and there's such a network, a large network around him. I want you to talk about it, but want to start with welcoming you first. Welcome,
Thank you so
Madhav.
much. Thank you so much. Glad to be here. I think before we can understand what makes Paul Kagame powerful, we have to go a little bit back in time. And we need to go back to right around World War I. There are three threads that I think that are important to understanding where Paul Kagame gets his power from. One is the development in the need for African minerals and resources by global powers. The other is what was going on in Rwanda during that time. And the third is how did Paul Kagame actually transition from a child in a refugee camp in Rwanda to now one of the most brutal dictators on earth? And so let's start with the first one. To understand why the West and other global powers need Africa, we sort of need to go back to World War I. Okay, prior to this time, the United States in particular was producing most of the minerals that it needed. Some estimates say it was about 96%. Subsequent to that, during World War I and the years that followed that, there was a lot of usage of fuel stocks and minerals, particularly in the form of giving that to allies. And there began to be an array of questions around how do we support increasing consumer demand in the United States and the increasing buildup of our militaries in both in the United States and in Western Europe. And it quickly became apparent that the techniques that were being used at that time were just not going to cut. And there was a big rush in the mining engineering sector that actually led to the rise of Herbert Hoover, who later became president. He was a mining engineer that sort of invented a very important process for mineral extraction that was particularly used in the Western United States. From there began to be this idea that the United States and other Western powers needed to be involved in overseas mining, and that it was particularly important for companies from the Western world to be the ones in charge of that, so that you could assure reliable mineral supplies. And the African continent was a centerpiece to that strategy. If you think about the African continent, and we'll talk a lot more about the DRC in particular, but the DRC by itself, there's an estimated $24 trillion worth of mineral reserves in the DRC, okay? The world's largest cobalt reserves. It's the biggest copper exporter in Africa. You have coltan, diamonds, gold, tin, tungsten, not only in the DRC, but in the adjoining countries as well. And so there are many areas of Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, Western Africa, that have an abundance of natural resources. And that is critical to understand because that is what makes, you have to have a motive to pursue these things. And you have to have a motive to create and partner with a man like Paul Kagame. And that is really the motive. And so that is one threat. Now, I think it's equally important to look at what was happening in Rwanda during those years as well. So the way that I'm going to do it, I think most of the audience might be familiar with Rwanda, but I'm going to go through it very simply because it's important to just look at the pattern. The actual players are not as significant, I think, to this part of the story as the overall pattern. So 1926, the Belgian colonialists began to issue these formal identity cards. And you sort of had this formal division among quote unquote ethnicities that was not previously really there. With that, one group really rose to power. And there was another much larger group of people that was sort of left behind in an economic sense and in a social sense as well. And when that happens, we've seen it in basically all parts of the world. People get very upset. People are deprived of basic rights. And eventually people revolt. And oftentimes, unfortunately, those revolts fall along. It's very easy to gravitate towards ethnic identities in that process. And so that's exactly what happened in Rwanda. And so during the late 1950s and 1960s, there was this revolt happening, and then the former group of people, the people that were formerly sort of at the upper tiers of the power structure, a lot of those people and the folks that were associated with them in terms of ethnic identity, these would be what we know as Tutsis, were forced to flee the country. Okay, along with some Hutus as well, but predominantly Tutsis. And so fled to Burundi, Uganda, Tanzania, and the DRC. Among those families that fled was actually Paul Kagame's family. Okay, and so Paul Kagame grew up in a refugee camp in Uganda. And I think that is critical to understanding where he comes from. Because the cruel irony in all of this is that the same system that promotes Paul Kagame, the dictator, is the same structure that probably harmed the childhood of Paul Kagame, the child. And so I think that is a very cruel irony to understand. So fast forward post-independence, 1960s, Rwanda is still quite an impoverished country. There is a change in leadership. There's a coup in the early 70s. And then there is some relative degree of of growth and some loose semblance of stability throughout the 70s and 80s. A lot of this was due to the coffee industry and the fact that you had what was called the International Coffee Agreement. This was brokered during the Kennedy administration in the early 60s, and it basically stabilized coffee prices. The rationale had been, especially in Latin America, that if coffee prices fell through the floor, a lot of those countries might be more inclined to go towards a communist structure or be more aligned with the USSR. And so that agreement sort of restricted production and exporting of coffee. Okay, and so during that time, there was also aid dollars that flowed into Rwanda, and there was a lot of corruption that occurred during that time. And aid projects and the surplus money from coffee exports were not put to good use. They were instead used to fill the pockets of people close to the leadership, which is the case in many unfortunate situations throughout the world. Okay. In 1987, the International Coffee Agreement collapsed, and it collapsed because there was a big dispute mostly around the type of coffee that people in the West had become accustomed to. There are two types of coffee at that time, Robusta and Arabica, and Arabica is perhaps a little bit richer, it has some different flavor properties, and that became more suitable to the palate of especially those in the United States. And so you had all these producers outside of the International Coffee Agreement too, like Vietnam, who were exporting unrestricted quantities of coffee. And so for a variety of reasons, that agreement collapsed. And then with it, coffee prices collapsed. And coffee at one point constituted 70% of Rwanda's exports. A lot of families depended on the price of coffee. And so you can easily imagine what that did. A lot of the small coffee farmers went essentially what we know as bankrupt. And so at that time, there were international financial institutions in place. So both the IMF and the World Bank came in with what's called a structural adjustment program. And unfortunately, one of the key things to understand is that the international financial structure often contributes to situations such as what arose in Rwanda with the genocide. The structural adjustment package often promotes austerity, as it did in Rwanda. There was a mandated currency devaluation, so the Rwandan franc went through the floor. Petrol prices, price of basic goods rose, and a lot of families fell into utter poverty. And that fueled a lot of resentment. It also fueled hunger in southern Rwanda, which is critical to understand. Southern Rwanda being more of a strictly rural region. Okay, and so that is the pretext for the years prior to the Rwandan genocide. Okay. Now let's go to the third thread. Paul Kagame. Paul Kagame, as I mentioned, grew up in Uganda. And the environment for Rwandan Tutsis in Uganda, unfortunately, was not a good one. These refugee camps were notoriously bad environments, especially for children. And even in his biography, Paul Kagame mentions it. He says there was very limited scope for upward mobility or something to that effect. And so in that environment, there was sort of a gravitation towards how can we rise amongst those in those refugee camps. And with Milton Obote in Uganda, there was a lot of discrimination, and there weren't those opportunities. Subsequently, Idi Amin came into power, and while he most certainly did not really care about the plight of Rwandan Tutsis, he did, during that time, some of them were able to work for Ugandan farms. Some of them were involved, unfortunately, in the brutal intelligence operations as well, carried out by Idi Amin. But there was certainly some social and economic growth that occurred amongst this population. From there, Paul Kagame sort of formed new relationships and formed a relationship with Yoweri Museveni. And that is a critical relationship to understand. So after Idi Amin fell, Obote came back into power and immediately identified the Rwandan Tutsi population as one that had been more affiliated with Idi Amin and imposed restrictions on them and, essentially returned them to much of their plight that they had prior to the years of Idi Amin. And with that, there was a lot of resentment brewing in Uganda about misrule and corruption. Western countries were, of course, involved in Uganda throughout all of this time, and a very similar state of affairs was present with aid, etc., and the misuse of aid and the corruption involved in aid. And Yoweri Museveni identified the Rwandan Tutsi population as a population that would be beneficial for him during essentially a rebellion. And so Museveni came into power in the 80s, and with him, Paul Kagame came into power. And very quickly rose through the ranks. At one point, he became the acting chief of military intelligence, which is very important to understand because you can go back to much of what he does today can kind of comes from the mind of an intelligence chief or a spy chief, and his paranoia and the way that he views the world around.
I think we need to underscore that part. It's important for people to understand there's the background of Paul Kagame as a refugee in Uganda, but then there's also the Kagame, the privileged guy who is basically at the top of Uganda's leadership when the RPF, or the Rwandan Patriotic Front, which was a Tutsi rebellion movement going up against a predominantly Hutu government, how basically he went from, how the song goes, started from the bottom, now we're here. He started from the bottom as a refugee, but he rose to the very top in a brutal way, by the way, with Museveni's war in Uganda. But then, continue. I just wanted to underscore and make sure that this is emphasized, that Kagame didn't just jump into Rwanda like something that fell out of heaven to stop the genocide. Kagame was made, by, from the years in his, youth, and then his privileges in Uganda, and now, as a privileged Ugandan, keep going.
And in fact, you're absolutely right, and thank you for underscoring that point. He was also, involved in. There was conflict in northern Uganda at that time as well, and there were also, reports of torture. And there's some implication that Paul Kagame was very much a part of all of that, and certainly would have been in his capacity, given how high up he was in the Ugandan military intelligence structure. From there, I think it's critical to understand. So the IMF came in with this package. You have 1990 roll around, and the leadership at that time, the Hutu leadership in Rwanda, made this deal with the IMF and the World Bank. And then subsequently, and it frustrates me that a lot of people don't realize this, there was an invasion by the Rwandan Patriotic Front of Rwanda in 1990. And at that time, Paul Kagame was not actually in Uganda and was not in Rwanda, and actually wasn't even in Africa. He was in the United States in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, studying military tactics, psyops, and the dissemination of propaganda. And at that time, the RPF invasion turned out to be a failure of some sort. And so a number of commanders were killed. And Paul Kagame at that time told his handlers in the United States, I'm going to go back to lead this movement. And by some accounts, he was sent back to lead this movement. And I think that is a critical piece, because for the Hutu government in Rwanda, they were backed by France, and they had sort of their backers as well. But the United States really helped Kagame get to where he is in more ways than one. And that was very apparent from the outset. Now, you might say, well, France and the United States were not at war, but it seems like they were supporting either side. And the way to understand this is that there was also a need to control the general state of affairs. There, at that time, poverty was going up. There was some indication that there was going to be conflict brewing in Rwanda and the region at large. And the mentality was to really control the transition, right? There are important things at stake, especially in Uganda. The rise of Paul Kagame, I think the evidence states this very clearly, is actually not all that much related to Rwanda. It was really related to Western policy in Uganda, and this idea that they had to back Museveni at all costs. It did not matter how many people he killed. It did not matter how corrupt he was. They found him to be a stable strategic ally in that region, and they stuck by him through everything. This included, even though they knew that arms were being passed from Uganda to the RPF, in 1991, the United States made a huge arms sale to Uganda. And that arms sale was so significant because it represented 10 times the amount that the United States had sold to Uganda compared to the previous 40 years combined. So a huge arms sale in the midst of a conflict to a brutal dictator, that can only lead to bad things. We've seen this story before, that can only lead to bad things, and sure enough, it did. Then you had the Arusha courts, etc. And there was actually a somewhat of a deal coming up whereby the RPF was going to be a part of a transitional government in Rwanda. At that moment, though, there was a lot of strife within Rwanda. And this is where the story gets complicated, because there are allegations that at the start of the genocide, of course, the plane carrying the then president of Rwanda and the president of Burundi was shot down. And the question has always been, who did that? And there was a column by Ellen Epstein in The Guardian in 2017 that lays out the evidence pretty well. And there are multiple other sources as well. But I would encourage people to read that.
Shout out to Helen Epstein. I think she's really good. She also just put out another article on the Congo. She's definitely look up the work by Helen Epstein.
Yeah, fantastic work. And I think she does a great job of laying this out. There is substantial suspicion that the planes might have been shot down by the RPF. And that has to do with the missiles that were involved. These were Russian-made SA-16 missiles that the Rwandan army did not have access to. No sales were made to the Rwandan army. And in an investigation by the Russian military, it was found that those missiles might have been sold to Uganda, which was known to be a pass-through to the RPF. There's substantial controversy about that. That was the subject of later arrest warrants from judges in Europe. I want to make clear that we don't know exactly what happened, but there is substantial controversy about what happened. Go ahead, Colin. You're saying something?
Yeah, I want to jump in there and add something about this controversy.
Yeah.
It's only controversy because I believe that, and it's the subject that you're about to get into, that Kagame's supporters refuse for this investigation to be carried out, because every testimony that's come out about the shooting of the plane has come from those who were a part of the RPF when the plane was shot. I have personally received testimony from Paul Kagame's bodyguard when they planned the shooting. I believe the meeting was on March 30th, 1994, when Lieutenant Alois Rienzi, who's also written it, he's written his testimony, it's out in the public. He said that in the meeting with Paul Kagame, Kayumba Nyamwasa, and a few other RPF officers, including Theonest Lizinde. Theonest Lizinde pulled out a map and showed everybody, and they planned out where they would shoot the plane from. We have seen testimony from Jean-Pierre Mugabe talking about the, I think that was probably the earliest, back maybe back in 1999, 2000, when he talked about the whole plot and how it was done. We've heard, I personally have gotten testimony and from both Alois Rienzi and James Mnyandinda, who was also one of Kagame's bodyguard, testifying that the plane shooting was carried out on orders by Paul Kagame. In addition, the book that just came out, Do Not Disturb by Michaela Wrong, talks about how Patrick Karegeya, who eventually becomes Paul Kagame's, and I think we're going to talk about him too, because he was running the Congo desk when they were looting, or they still are looting and plundering the Congo. Patrick Karegeya admitted to the UK embassy in Uganda that he was a part of the team that shot down the plane. So there's plenty of testimony from people, coming out of the ranks of the RPF. There's been nobody else. We've also seen evidence of how they used the pickup, how they transported the missiles from northern Rwanda down to Kigali, and then from the building, the CND building, the parliament building, in a white pickup truck, as specific as a white pickup truck, to the hill where they set up the missiles and shut down the planes. And they also knew the American ambassador to Rwanda, Robert Flatten, had already told Kagame and Habyarimana, the previous president, that if any act of violence like that takes place, there's going to be mass murder. So I just wanted to make sure that this is also out there. The controversy is not that controversial. This is more like, when we talk about Black Lives Matter and, police brutality, some people pretend that this doesn't happen, but this is real.
And I think you're 100% correct. And one thing that I was going to mention is that the controversy, as you said, only exists because of incomplete or skewed investigations. The investigation that was done by two French judges at the beginning of the last decade omitted several key facts, and it speaks to what appears to be a level of protection that they want to afford Paul Kagame. And I think that a more thorough investigation would likely reveal the facts that you just mentioned, for all the world to see. And that was the basis for the arrest warrants that were issued in Europe.
Yep. And in fact, by the way, for somebody who is not guilty of a crime, if they accuse you of a crime, you actually want to exonerate yourself. But instead, they actually fight these court proceedings.
Absolutely. Or in the case of the charges that were issued or the arrest warrants that were issued from Spain, which wasn't even for Paul Kagame, but was for his sort of inner circle of associates, he brushed those off, saying that the judge could go to hell. Right. And I think that gets us back to where we started, which is how does somebody in his position have the power to do that? And so I think that is sort of the history leading up to the genocide. I think one of the other things that I'll mention was that there was sort of increasing encroachment by the RPF prior to April 1994. That scattered a lot of people. Some people say it was into the hundreds of thousands, and that really aided. At that time, the Rwandan government was particularly corrupt and was sinking, and they saw sort of maybe identity politics as a way to sort of keep themselves in power, which is an unfortunate fact and something that happens all too often and leads to violence. So from there, it's well known that after the genocide, Paul Kagame planned and directed an invasion of then Zaire, now what we know as the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And I think that's where this part of the story really, really takes off, because there is, a certain irony if you look at the size of Rwanda and you look at the size of the DRC. How did Rwanda invade the DRC? Up until that time, the dictator of the DRC, Mobutu, was sort of a key ally for Western countries in particular in the region. But at that time, Paul Kagame, and at that time, Mobutu's sort of grip on the country was starting to loosen, and there was general discontent. Paul Kagame really emerged as a strong man for the region, and that is crucial to understand about why he has become so powerful. It's not because he's the president of a country that is 13 million people. It's because he is a strong man for the region, in terms of the way that he is able to sort of carry out operations, etc. So he
Can
plans
we translate strong man to our audience? Because a lot of our audience probably didn't grow up in a dictatorship, right?
Yeah.
When we say strong man.
So he has complete control over the military, which is a very key element of this. When you identify a particular autocrat or dictator that you want to be your point person for a region, you want to look for a couple things. You want them to have complete control, which Paul Kagame established. You want them to be efficient in terms of how they carry out intelligence operations and military operations. And unfortunately, Paul Kagame has proven himself to be extremely efficient. And the third thing is that you want him placed in a region that is of strategic importance. The eastern portion of the DRC is a very, very important region from a strategic perspective. And that's critical to understand. The minerals that are there that's trillions of dollars worth of minerals. The gold belt is there, the copper belt. There's now lithium there, and then it abuts what we know as the diamond belt as well. And so,
it seems like every strategic mineral that comes up at every era, in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s and 2000s and 2010s, and now in the 2020s, lithium. Right, in the 2000s and 2010s, it was, coltan and gold. Gold is still a big thing now.
Yeah.
But Congo just has it.
They just have it. They just have it. And they have also, I think it's worth mentioning, they have the farmland to be able to feed upwards of 1 billion people. This is not a country that should be impoverished and have 22 people facing acute hunger. And have this much conflict. So that it is a very resource-rich country. So Kagame really emerges as sort of a strongman stabilizer for the region. And that is his importance, and that is the role that he plays. You want, as consumption increased, and this was particularly important because at the turn of the century, at the turn of the millennium, there were more electronic devices being put into people's hands. There was more emphasis on technology-oriented consumption, right? And that, exactly. And that led to a coltan shortage in 2000 and 2001. At that time, it was because armed groups were being funded through coltan mining as well at that time, it was illegal to source DRC coltan. But from confidential mining primaries that we've seen from the United States State Department, they have knowledge that international companies sourced DRC coltan through both Uganda and Rwanda, and so that is your motive right there. If you can think about it, how many hundreds of thousands to how many millions of people died to put these things in our hands, and when we needed those minerals, we chose to back a man like Paul Kagame because he would assure our supply lines, and that is what makes him uniquely powerful.
And just to give the audience a sense, between 1997, if I read the reports, a lot of the not only the UN reports but other reports that show the export of minerals, and this is any minerals that you cannot find in Rwanda's soil. I mean, the spike was
enormous.
Yeah, it was enormous in the late 90s, the early 2000s, and all of a sudden you had coltan coming from Rwanda when there is
When
no
there's a
coltan.
shortage, when the world needs coltan,
Yeah,
they went and got it,
yeah,
despite how many people were killed. And
and you
that
had it in Uganda. Yeah,
yeah. And so that is, I think, a crucial element of this story and of Paul Kagame's story.
so let's emphasize the role of consumers,
Yeah,
us, and the people who are watching this.
yeah,
As a part of, because you just touched on it a little bit. Every one of us wanted these electronics, you
yeah,
know, and here we are. We are consuming things, not unaware that millions of people are being killed in order to access, these things. Talk about, the importance of consumers in this whole thing, and why we also are a part of why Kagame is as powerful as he is.
yeah. And so I think a lot of Paul Kagame's ego rests on his power. And the reason why he is this powerful is because we need what he provides, or we think we need what he provides, which is these minerals that make up our phones, not only phones, jewelry, pieces of car battery. And now as we're moving towards a renewable energy transition, batteries. And so there are a number of applications for what we get from the DRC and the region at large. This is not a story that's unique to the DRC, by the way. If you look at West Africa, for instance, and what's gone on in Mali, where there has been a military coup and the presence there from both the United States and France. Barrick Gold is who's doing the gold mining in Mali,
And
okay,
yeah,
and the DRC,
yes,
and
Barrick
in many
Gold is
places
down
around
there.
the world, in
Yeah,
many very vulnerable places around the world.
yeah.
It's essentially the same players. And so you have to understand that this is not a story about the DRC or Rwanda. This is about a power structure that really rewards people like Paul Kagame because he keeps the minerals flowing. Now, as consumers, that we eventually need to make a choice, right? Are we going to continue to accept the deaths of millions of people for minerals that we perceive to be so important that we can't live without them, or are we going to demand and actually say there must be actually demand a supply chain that is rid of these conflict minerals? Now, many people say that that is difficult to ensure. There are difficulties to ensure it, but we've put a man on the moon. I think we can, there are things that can be done to assure that these minerals are safe, especially because along the way, as minerals were smuggled out of the Congo in particular, we have an idea of who is doing the smuggling, who the main players are. And they are still at large. If you think about where, for example, a lot of the gold goes from the Congo, and we've seen in later years huge discrepancies in the export numbers provided by Rwanda for gold versus the import tickets for Rwandan gold that have been published by the UAE for gold taken to Dubai. We see a lot of those minerals increasingly going to the Emirate of Dubai, and that should be very concerning because at that point, Dubai's gold market is amongst the biggest in the world. Provides about 20% of their trading in gold is about 20% of Dubai's GDP. And if you think about how rich the Emirates is in general, that should be a shocking number.
So let's talk to the people watching, those who are wearing necklaces and
Yeah,
gold watches and bracelets and things like that,
yeah,
about what we are actually paying for, a part
yeah.
of the price that people are paying in order for us to have these things.
Right. So a
And
vast
and
majority.
what it really is the purpose of gold. That also might help with
Yeah. So
what he
gold
says.
has an application in electronics, but a lot of the gold is actually used for jewelry and for a means of transferring wealth that is not as susceptible to currency shocks. So if you a lot of the gold that is taken out from different parts of Africa and illegally smuggled out ends up becoming jewelry. And so for people watching and consumers out there, I think that this is something that we need to emphasize. People adorn their bodies with gold that is basically taken from, but that is based off the blood of children. Okay, and unless we can fight back against that, it's as simple as that. The gold that is coming out of the Congo has caused millions of children to die. Okay, the gold, the other minerals as well. That is, unless we can accept that fact and demand that these supply chains be free of these conflict minerals, I think that this is unfortunately going to continue. So it's really up to the consumers. Nobody else is going to demand it, because Paul Kagame is banking on the fact that nobody will care enough to make that argument and make that a priority.
Not enough consumers care about either giving up the gold or making a demand, right?
Exactly, and that is where a lot of his power comes from. As long as he keeps the minerals flowing, he knows that countries will the powers that be in the world will sort of rush to support and aid him. And so that is really where his strength comes from. And I think, in particular, his involvement in North Kivu and South Kivu, which are in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we have to understand that in those areas, Paul Kagame is particularly strong, and the intelligence forces are sort of directed by Kigali. The main buying houses at one point, the smuggling routes kind of go through Rwanda. There's been increasing competition between Rwanda and Uganda over minerals from the DRC, over who can get richer, and that's sort of the basis for some of the fallout between Museveni and Kagame.
Yeah.
But that we have to understand his strength in those areas, and that he sort of controls a lot of the day-to-day life in those areas. Not only there, but also in Katanga, which is a very rich copper belt. You had enormous Western companies going in, as well as an Australian company. I think Anvil was there, but you had First Quantum, Freeport, McMoran, some of the big mining players in the world were doing business in Katanga and North and South Kivu. But now you see this. Now there's a huge lithium lithium push there as well, a huge lithium mine called the Monono project. And so that is led by a Perth-based company. It's a company based out of Australia called AZV Minerals. But that could be the biggest source of non-brine lithium in the world. And if you think about the strategic importance of lithium coming out, my fear is that we might actually worsen the problem through the increased demand that we're seeing. And so that is something that we need to, the consumers are really the only ones that can solve this. Because if you think about consumers and taxpayers, no leadership institution around the world has taken this problem on. It's been going on for more than 20 years. And they will never take this on unless they're pushed to do so by consumers. There's been maybe some pushes through the Dodd-Frank Act in the United States, and sort of for diamonds in particular, there was a Kimberley process, et cetera. But we know that there have been giant holes in those processes, and that unfortunately problems have continued. And so it's going to take a significant push to solve this, and that can really only come from consumers. And in terms of what people can do, right. When was the last time that anyone in the audience wrote their congressman about something like this, or wrote their representative here in Europe? You wrote your member of parliament.
Right.
There are practical steps. You'd be surprised what a hearing from 100 people will do to a representative's mind. And I think unless we try doing that, again,
I would like to talk about that. Just want to. I think it'd be remiss. You just talked about the Perth-based company. I forget the mining.
AZV
the
Minerals.
name of it. Easy.
Or AVZ Minerals.
AVZ Minerals.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how many, when you look at the Congo, how many mining companies are exploiting the Congo that are based either in Australia, which you never hear about, or Canada.
Yeah.
These are the worst. When you think of some of these multinationals, some of the worst ones come from these places. In a sense, the more I thought about it, leading up to this conversation, it's not that surprising when you look at what Canada has done to the indigenous population in Canada and
lacks
Australia.
laws. I mean, lacks oversight laws, lacks disclosure laws. I mean, it's really made for a perfect storm. And you're right. If at one point too, in 2013 or so, there's sort of survey done, and 75% of the mining companies were based in Canada.
Yeah.
So,
in the mining industry in Canada, on Canadian citizens themselves is exploitative. It exploits the miners in horrible ways. Safety measures and everything. So when you think about exporting, and given last week we got the verdict on Derek Chauvin, given basically the lack of Black Lives Mattering, in these countries, it's not surprising that the big, exploiters are also some of the ones that are some of the some of the places where, as much as they're polite, they're nice and all of that, but they're really brutal. And I've seen in cases where you talk about things like this, you talk about those companies and they actually bring lawsuits, except a lot of times they stop them because they know they probably won't win and they may get exposed to the public. But I just wanted to point out that these multinational companies are all over the world, but there's so many of them that are based in Canada and Australia.
Yeah, and they're supported by an international finance system too, right? Because if you look at some of the big backers, there are Chinese investors involved in AVZ Minerals. There are also there's a J.P. Morgan Chase, there's BNP Paribas, Citigroup as well, and so you see some of the same players that you always see, and so that gets us to the other aspect of this, which many people think that this is a problem that I have no control over, or that even the representatives, the public representatives in sort of Western countries have said, well, it's a tough problem to solve. One of the things that they could do right away is crack down on the banking system. And that's one thing that they have not done, despite the fact that we know through releases like the FinCEN papers that that conflict gold resulted in the flow of money in places like Dubai. And so, the importance of sort of the de facto leader, the ruler of the UAE, Mohammed bin Zayed, and then the Emir of Dubai, Mohammed bin Rashid, is such that in a few years ago, the United States had a very compelling case against the Kalori Jewelry Group, which is a huge jewelry group based out of Dubai.
Yep.
And at that time, despite having such overwhelming evidence, the United States, because of political considerations, refused to act. And so these representatives, they can and should act. Remember, for all the viewers out there, these are things that are being done in your name, right? This is where we thought our tax dollars, some of it was going towards enforcement of laws, but instead it's not going to that. It's going to fill in the pockets of major corporations, or go into a State Department that is very invested in promoting the needs of multinational corporations abroad, but seems to not have as much engagement on these issues.
Yeah, and to actually give a picture to the global audience, if the US can go after FIFA's, which is the biggest basically sporting organization, they run football or soccer all over the world. If they can go after them for international money laundering, they surely can go after somebody like Kagame and other players, and banks, American banks, for example. You talked about J.P. Morgan Chase. Also, in I believe it was 2009, it might have been 8, 9, or 10, when the CNDP in the Congo was wreaking havoc, with General Laurent Kunda. There were reports that money was being transferred through Citibank. That is an American bank. So these representatives definitely can play a role, but we, as citizens,
you need to push them. You need to
we
push
gotta
them
push
to
them.
play the role. They're not going to play the role by themselves because these are hard conversations to have. If you think about the geopolitical importance of a country like the UAE or some of these other big partners, there are different sort of quote unquote security considerations at play with those folks, and so you cannot allow this piece to be compromised for the sake of some fake security apparatus, right? That is mostly not targeted to solving the needs of everyday people, but is rather targeted probably towards mostly maintaining power in those countries, unfortunately. But I would also say at this point that there's one person that I'd like to highlight as particularly important, and that is Mark Holtzman, who is the chairman
Yes.
of the Bank of Kigali. While we're on the subject of banking,
Yes.
this is a gentleman whose history I think is very important to understand. So I'll just talk very briefly about him. Mark Holtzman grew up in Pennsylvania to a wealthy family, and from sort of an early age was very interested and invested in the politics of Ronald Reagan, and became, in fact, one of the key sort of elements of Ronald Reagan's campaign in Pennsylvania in the election of 1980. Subsequently, he became the executive director of an organization called Citizens for America, which was an organization that was basically there to promote the economic and defense agenda of Ronald Reagan, which can be summed up in three words: deregulation, intervention, exploitation. Okay, so that was their agenda, and in fact, in 1985, shortly the actual conference happened after Mark Holtzman resigned as executive director, but there was a conference in Angola with a particularly brutal U.S.-backed group, UNITA, and various other rebel groups throughout the globe, representatives from
And
Contras
that
and
was
Nicaragua.
in the UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi, was backed, in a similar way that Kagame has invaded the Congo
By South
by
Africa and the United States.
the apartheid South Africa, the U.S., and Mobutu,
Yeah,
who was the yesteryear's Paul Kagame of the region.
exactly.
Now Kagame has replaced him.
Yeah. So that is Mark Holtzman's background, and so afterwards he ran for election for Congress in Pennsylvania. Got beaten quite badly, and then went into finance, particularly in Eastern Europe. And as part of that, there were some allegations. He had gotten a grant from a U.S. government-funded program for this boutique investment firm in Eastern Europe, and there were some allegations of sort of financial mispropriety. And while they were never solidly investigated, I think that is important to understand that this guy has a little bit of a checkered past. For people that are from Colorado in the United States, we know Mark Holtzman quite well because he was the president of the University of Denver and subsequently ran for governor in Colorado. And that I think is important because as part of that, he said some awful and untrue things about undocumented immigrants. So this is not somebody that cares about people in general. Okay, he has said in the past, that he cares about Rwanda and the less fortunate among us. This is not that guy. That is very important to understand. Subsequently, after he lost in the primaries in Colorado, he went on to become the executive vice chairman of Barclays. And that is a very powerful position. He had connections throughout the world. He worked in for a bank in Kazakhstan, for an investment firm based out of Hong Kong. This is a man with global connections. And actually, it was around the time that he was at Barclays. It was 2008, 2009. There was Barclays was actually looking at purchasing a 70% stake in the Bank of Kigali at that time, and so there were that was sort of lined up, but that was sort of in the midst of the recession. So it was around that time that Mark Holtzman became particularly close to Paul Kagame, and then subsequently became the chairman of the Bank of Kigali and later became the chairman of the largest financial institution in Zimbabwe, CBZ as well. And so this is critical to understand, because with these conflict minerals and all these things, you got to think about how people access that money and how people launder that money. And what many people don't know is that they'll do it through real estate, they'll do it through banks. These are we are capable of catching these things. In fact, we've had evidence of this type of activity all around the world. But the FinCEN papers are particularly important for that, because they've demonstrated that governments just don't act on those things, often for very cynical geopolitical considerations. And so, in terms of Mark Holtzman, he's a key player in this structure because he connects Kagame to the world, and connects him to the financial in the financial landscape internationally in a way that Kagame himself probably would not be able to access by himself. And so that is particularly helpful, you can imagine, in innovating laws and innovating international financial transparency regulations. And so I think we have to understand that, Paul Kagame's even domestic boards are staffed by largely people from Europe and the United States now. And so he's not some dictator in Africa just out there by himself, kind of just repressing his people, which is unfortunately the narrative that comes out a lot. He's they call him the master developer in Rwanda, which the statistics, as was shown by an investigation by the Financial Times, are very, very suspect. During a period from 2011 to 2014, when the Rwandan government said and reported that poverty decreased, it appears that poverty probably increased during that period. And so it's not that people don't know, right? Like, it's not that people in powerful positions don't know. It's that he's there for a particular purpose for them, and he's their man in that area. And until there's sufficient pressure on these representatives, they have no incentive to change.
I think right now there is something happening on the continent that would actually kind of paint the picture. You look at Paul Kagame is the representative of not only, so far, if we can summarize, the things that you've touched on. So he represents corporate interest for Western governments. He's protected by Western companies, multinationals, plus Australians. And then he is protected by Western governments.
And not only that, it's not only just Western governments. If you look at China's investment in the DRC and China's investment in Africa and the investment of the UAE in Africa, you would never expect the UAE to be amongst the top, financiers in Africa, or the top investors. But that's exactly who Mark Holtzman. That's exactly the type of crowd that Mark Holtzman brings in. And so, it's various global powers throughout the world. And I think that's critical to understand, that this is a global problem. This is not a Rwandan problem. This is not a DRC problem. This is not even an African problem. This is a global problem.
Agreed. The thing I wanted to point out to the audience is this past week, the president of Chad died, Idris Deby. And Africans are not crying.
Yeah, he was killed. He was killed. He was killed in a battle.
Yeah, he was killed, and Africans are not crying over him being killed because we are aware of the destruction that he's brought on the continent. He is the Paul Kagame of North Central Africa, because Absolutely. He pretty much he plays a similar role to Paul Kagame. So I just want to point out that, as you say, this is a global issue, and these types of strong men and dictators are placed around various, strategic areas. So, Idris Deby was the man in the Sahel. You have Paul Kagame in the Central East Africa. In the Horn of Africa, you had Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia, who is now, I believe, they're still looking for a replacement. And Ethiopia is very unstable right now.
Yeah.
The war, a bloody war going on there. And then you go to a little further up in
Egypt.
central, you go to Egypt, right?
Egypt, the big
Egypt.
player that that Western powers help through via the UAE, etc., help topple a government there.
Right.
And
Elected
so,
by the people, uh,
and just because, and I think that that's important, right? Because it suggests to me that um, there is a belief that these are not people worthy of having sovereignty. And that is what we must realize, that the prevailing sentiment in all of this international power structure is that these are not people that should be allowed to enjoy the fruits of their land, the fruits of their labor, and should not also be able to determine in the way that we do, at least, who governs them. And because regardless, Muslim Brotherhood comes to power in Egypt, there are sort of practical consequences for that, but that is what democracy entails, right? Sometimes people that you don't want get elected. We replace him now with a brutal dictator of just epic proportions, and next door in Libya, this is a very similar parallel. When fighting broke out in Libya, there was a former general who was initially under Muammar Gaddafi, who participated in Libya's invasion of Chad and then was subsequently part of that failure and had a falling out with Gaddafi that became what appears to be a CIA asset. He lived for a long time in Langley, Virginia, and then subsequently in Arlington, Virginia. He still owns a property here. He's currently current on his property taxes. He went back in the midst of the sort of the revolution in Libya, and he formed an army. And Khalifa Haftar has been armed by the UAE. He's been armed by Egypt. It appears with weapons initially made in the United States. And this is another example of you have to control the transition, right? So that you play both sides. In the case of Idris Deby, the sad thing that has happened in that part of Africa is, of course, the rise of Boko Haram, right? And Boko Haram rose out of very similar circumstances to multiple armed groups in the Congo, right? Which is, if in that case, there was more drought, food shortage, but if people are impoverished and people are being treated badly, unfortunately, these types of armed groups start to become appealing. And you've seen people from Niger and Chad go over the border into Nigeria to form now what we call a terrorist organization. You go to Cameroon, Paul Biya, right? This same thing. We have tolerated everything that he has done because we have security arrangements with him. We have a major drone base in northern Cameroon. Algeria and the military junta in Algeria, with the shale gas that Algeria provides. Algeria's military junta and in particular their security apparatus has been known to pass information to AQIM, which is Al Qaeda in the Maghreb, and so they have coordinated in some cases with terrorist groups. Yet we have turned a blind eye to that. The world has turned a blind eye to that because of certain things that they provide, and so that this is sort of a recurring pattern. It's not even just in Africa; it happens throughout the world. So I think one of the big things is until people sort of demand a different way of doing things and demand that laws apply to people, right? There's a reason why you have laws on the books. If you just refuse to enforce them because of geopolitical considerations, then that's not the mark of a civilized society. And then the last thing that I will say is, I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention the peacekeeping aspect of this, because I think that is important. So Rwanda provides now I believe it's the third largest peacekeeping force to the United Nations Peacekeeping Corps. I think second only to Ethiopia and Bangladesh. For a country of its size, that's a huge number. And it reflects the utter lack of commitment from particularly Western countries, in terms of saying what is the role of a UN peacekeeping mission, right? That we must. The reason why you have UN peacekeepers from all different countries, one of the reasons was supposed to be that everybody had a stake to keep things peaceful, but instead you have a force that is almost being used as a, I hate to call it mercenary organization, but you essentially are able to say, well, he's able to provide us troops when we can put those in places, those folks in places like Darfur, so that our young men and women don't have to go there. And while I don't want, my neighbors here in the United States to have to go there, I don't want anybody to go to go there. I want that area to be peaceful. So first you create a problem, and then to maintain security, you have, unfortunately, the UN turns to places like Rwanda, where they can
so
supply troops.
like aren't those known as mercenaries? Isn't that the word for hired armies or hired,
It would
soldiers,
appear
hired
that way.
guns? I mean,
And it's a sad thing to say, because UN peacekeeping missions were supposed to reflect the commitment of the world to keeping an area safe, right? It was supposed to be a noble thing, but increasingly it's being turned to it's being reduced to this. We've heard of, unfortunately, abuses committed by UN peacekeeping
yeah.
missions, which is a very, very cruel irony, right? And a number of those places, if you look, those are places where Rwandan troops were present.
I
As
definitely want to call those out. You look at Darfur and the human rights abuses, the rapes and the violence against the people. You look at Haiti, and you look at the Central African Republic,
Yeah.
and who is the common denominator in those places?
Unfortunately,
It's
forces from the RDF.
right, the Rwandan forces, the Paul Kagame soldiers in those places. So this is also, and also another thing that these peacekeeping missions have done that I think is very destructive is it's used as blackmail. When the UN mapping report was leaked to the media, and when it finally was released, the government of Rwanda, which the mapping report documented that they had committed possible genocide in the Congo, which I personally, based on the definition of genocide, the Rwandan military, Paul Kagame's forces did commit genocide in the Congo. And my, I remember when the mapping report came out, the government of Rwanda threatened to pull their peacekeepers out of places like Darfur and other peacekeeping missions, but they're not keeping peace. That's number one. And two, they use that as blackmail, but I really think it's more to kind of push, these Western governments, especially, but the UN bodies, into saying, oh, we're not gonna, let's not, have this, this dictator in a corner, crying and kicking. We don't want to hear this noise. But really, in practice, this isn't something that should be used as blackmail. This isn't something that should even fly. They could be removed, and things would not change that much, or if at all.
Yeah, I agree with you. One of the big things that I think has changed over the past 20 years is after the Iraq War, there began to be more of a focus on how do we avoid large-scale troop deployments. Because with large-scale troop deployments, there comes greater scrutiny and greater awareness of what's going on. So largely now, there are unmanned missions, there are covert operations, and basically you empower other forces to do your bidding in those areas. And unfortunately, we see a lot of the third category, which means we basically end up sacrificing the local population to suit our geopolitical or strategic needs. And if this will not change unless people people pressure their representation. That's
So,
unfortunately the fact.
well, let's talk about that. Pressuring representation and pressuring governments, especially Western governments, to places where like the U.S., in the U.K. and others, where there is a path and a way to actually push. And maybe a good way to get into this conversation is, we've talked a lot about the UAE, we've talked a lot about Dubai. One of the things that happened recently that connects the US, Dubai, and Rwanda was the kidnapping of Paul Rusesabagina, who most people who know Rwanda probably know Rwanda because of the film Hotel Rwanda. Most people cannot even find Rwanda on the map. Most people don't know that Kagame is a real, if you're like an English speaker and you see Kagame, you probably think it's a game, some type of a game. But Hotel Rwanda was really the thing that put Rwanda on the global map. And the person, the real life hero of that film is Paul Rusesabagina. The actor was Don Chiro. And Paul Rusesabagina was tricked from leaving his home in the US to Dubai, and from Dubai, he was tricked and abducted to Rwanda, and today is facing charges in Rwanda. One of the things that happened was that the US, 37 members of Congress, mostly, I believe it was mostly senators, if I remember correctly, called, or maybe it was just Congress people.
I think it's a mixture too.
Yeah, and they called for Rwanda releasing Paul Rusesabagina and letting him return to his home in the US. And if there's an extradition case, that they would extradite him, which the US has actually extradited multiple people from the US to Rwanda. Kagame has not released Paul Rusesabagina, and he's also, but it takes, let's talk about not only how public pressure can help in terms of, pushing the representatives, both not only for the release of Paul Rusesabagina, but also on the banks and this international money laundering that Paul Kagame is involved in, and the role of us and the viewers and others who are watching in various places.
So, I mentioned one example with Kalodi, and that is a big example, because that's a lot of conflict gold that provides the fuel for a lot of conflict, especially in Africa. There's been substantially no pressure from Congress on the executive branch about that. So, if you are interested in this issue, call your congressman, and if you're in the United States or if you're in Europe, call your member of parliament, or send them an email about this
Canada
issue.
and Australia.
And Canada and Australia, of course. And understand. And I think the biggest thing is that understand what the problem is, which, in my view, I think the evidence bears this out. It's because we have a structure that's mostly geared towards the interests of major corporations, that we sometimes occasionally benefit from in the form of phones, etc. And we think that we require their involvement for us to have these things. But you have to pressure your direct representatives to pressure the executive of the country to take action on these items, because the evidence is there. I mean, they know that it's happening. They have the evidence for Kalodi, for instance. And it's been well documented, but there's substantially no movement in Congress from that, in the United States especially. And so that, be specific about the instances that you're talking about. Just saying we need more regulation generally is, they've heard that all before. I think it's helpful to be specific about a particular case, but if you called your representative, 100 people calling a single representative about the case of Paul Rusesabagina, for instance, can be pretty powerful, in terms of promoting some action. So, and I think the other thing is understand that the circumstances in which he was abducted. It being abducted from Dubai. Dubai is one of the most heavily surveilled cities in the world, and there has been, in the aftermath of a kidnapping or an abduction or an intelligence operation on your soil. If you were, just think about it this way: if you're a country and you had an intelligence operation done on your soil by a foreign government, would you not sort of be a little bit upset about that and look a little bit deeper to see how that happened? I would find that very worrisome, especially if you are the Emirate of Dubai or the UAE in general, which has prided itself on security. That is their almost singular focus. And so if you're in that boat, I would anticipate that they would have made some noise by now, but there hasn't been anything coming out from them. So that is worrisome for me and suggests some degree of complicity. I think the other aspect of this is understand that these folks have powerful business partners. BlackRock, these big financial institutions, BlackRock, KKR, they're involved with Abu Dhabi's national oil pipeline company. All of these folks sort of work together, and these relationships transcend boundaries or national boundaries. And so if you understand things in that context, you'll see that pressuring your direct representative to take action can have an effect, because oftentimes there is something that has been done within your the legal jurisdiction of your country on which you can take action, right? You just have to press them to do it. If money is flowing through banks that are located in the United States ought to take action and can take action. Same thing for the EU. So this is not a problem that is happening in the DRC or in Rwanda or in one country in particular. It is a global system that touches almost every country in the world. And one of the effects of that is that if people want to take action, there's a way to curtail the flow of money. And understanding that this can be done is very important.
Yeah, so let's to continue this conversation, especially in terms of these Western governments. Before I bring up my analogy, there is a couple of things, and this is probably a good time for us to, for me to read the message from our one of our sponsors, Friends of the Congo. They had a forum yesterday that talked about what's happening in Benin. Again, the massacres that are happening in Benin are a part of this global, this global context that you're giving. But basically, the statement says, many knowledgeable Congolese believe that what is unfolding in Benin is part of the 20-year war of aggression against Congo kicked off by Museveni and Kagame. And the appeal is for justice-seeking and peace-loving people around the world to shine a light on the atrocities being committed in Benin and support campaigns led by Congolese to bring about peace and justice in Benin and the east of the Congo. A critical path to this peace and justice is bringing the butcher in Kigali to book for his war crimes and crimes against humanity, both in Rwanda and the Congo. To do that requires, I'm done reading the statement, but for me, doing that requires political will from these various entities around the world. And that's where we all become stakeholders in places where we are. So we've got to think globally and act locally. And I think
exactly.
that's what your
local action can have global
impact.
Consequences or global impact.
Yeah. And so to bring in the audience into the conversation, we have a request from M. Marthanto saying, let's talk about the sponsorship of Kagame and how much billions of dollars he has gained in the last decade and how much death he's left behind. I think we've talked about that a little bit, but we may just highlight in general the support that.
I think that there, we talked a little bit about the conflict minerals element. I think the one thing that I would add is aid and the politics of aid.
Yes.
Um, Rwanda is still a country that is officially dependent on foreign aid. If you look at their official development assistance to gross capital formation ratio, it tends to be 40 to 50%, and that hasn't budged in several years. So that they still receive quite a bit of aid. The question is, in many countries around the world, we see aid packages being given, but not necessarily the impact that we hope to see. And I think that that is particularly apparent in Rwanda, despite how many times Paul Kagame says it's the Singapore of Africa. It's not. It's not that. There's still quite a bit of poverty despite all of these big aid packages that have been given. And I think aid is unfortunately used increasingly as a political tool. Okay, there to sort of buy access, to buy sort of loyalty, and that is a very unfortunate aspect of this system, because the alternative is, Paul Kagame will say, otherwise a lot of children in Rwanda will starve, and that
Yeah.
that is how um, that is how it's presented, and it's not a binary choice, right? You don't need to feed a dictator to be able to feed children. So
Yep, I keep hearing that, and my pushback on that claim is when you give a dictator and a war criminal resources, they commit more crimes. They
yeah,
commit more war crimes
yeah,
against the very people, those same people that you're
trying to
supposedly,
help. Yeah,
yeah,
they're trying to help.
yeah,
Yeah, and so unfortunately, we have to understand that aid is not given based off of need in the current system, and that's important to understand. If you look at these big aid packages that have been given, they've been given despite the fact that the Rwandan government has repeatedly lied about statistics and has demonstrably lied about them. So um, I think that that is an important aspect. A lot of the aid, not only in Rwanda but in a lot of what you might call the developing world, um, results in corruption, results in government contracts that are siphoned off, results in enrichment of a class that is particularly close to sort of the ruling power, and I think that that is very apparent in Rwanda. Not only that, there are partnerships that have been taking place between people that are very close to Paul Kagame and Western companies. For example, the collaboration on the Kigali City Tower with Dubai Ports World, and another major investor from Uganda. If you look at the involvement of Hatari Sakoko, somebody that is very close to Paul Kagame, and his collaboration, shall we say, with Marriott in Rwanda. So they you can't expect, if you keep on feeding the beast, that the beast will somehow go away, right? It's
and so again, I think that's you've emphasized it, and I think this is where we need to continue to emphasize public pressure. Those who are in the media shine a light on this, and those of us who are, citizens, push these members of Congress, but also I believe the State Department, in the U.S., for
mhm.
example, and these other uh, executive departments that don't necessarily answer the voters necessarily. We have to absolutely raise. We got to raise hell,
Yeah,
so that so that things can change. And there is a quote I like from um, Frederick Douglass, who is the person that actually inspired me into activism. And he said, "Power concedes nothing without a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand, and it never has, never will, And so we got to push. We got to push. And he's also said, where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe. And I think the excuse of saying that Kagame, provides this stability and safety is going to, I mean, Frederick Douglass, to me, these are words of prophecy,
Yeah.
and
And it's also stability and safety for whom?
go ahead.
That's the question. And we cannot just have safety and stability for mining companies or mining supply chains and criminal organizations. At some point, things are going to reach a breaking point, as we've seen throughout the world in the past. And I really worry in a post-Kagame Rwanda, which direction is this headed? Because there are so many unresolved problems, so much unresolved poverty. That's going to be the world is going to have to reckon with that. And it's better that we recognize that now and take action on it before something, like a genocide occurs.
Yeah, yep. And that's going to take us doing some work. That's going to take us doing some work again. One more from Frederick Douglass. It says that those who profess freedom yet depreciate agitation, which is what we must do. We must agitate. So it says, those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. And again, it doesn't take a lot. It's not going to be a major inconvenience to those who choose to make a difference in the world, to think globally and act locally. And it's just, I think, to wrap up this conversation, we need to talk about the importance of shining a light on this and really emphasize on it, Madav. But before we do that, I just wanted to bring in the audience a couple more times. We've got Nelson Mohirwa, who's asking, does President Kagame draw his power from the Rwandan masses supposedly behind him, or from Western powers to whom he's been a distinguished ally since the end of the genocide in 1994? I think you've answered the second part. The first part is, does he draw any power from Rwandan masses? When we look at this whole global setup.
I think that his control over the media in Rwanda is particularly important. His control over the source of information for people in Rwanda has increased the tolerance of a particular group of people for the suffering of their fellow people in Rwanda. This propaganda about we are developing and we are becoming the Singapore of Africa. We're becoming this amazing investment destination. If that's repeated enough times, people they don't have an alternative to that, right? Like they start to believe it. And despite what they're seeing, they start to rationalize that, perhaps it's coming. Perhaps the money is coming. Perhaps the development is coming. It sounds like, my friend somewhere told me that part of town has developed, so this part of town will eventually be developed. And I think that affects thinking, right? You think that something is always coming when there is no intention of actually getting anything to you. The trick I think that he has done is that, in terms of literacy, etc., there have been some modest gains, but you have to. The trick is if you don't do anything, people are going to revolt very quickly. You have to do something, siphon off a huge amount of money, and then you still have impoverished people, but you keep them attach to you with the idea that things will be turning for the better for them, and that something will be eventually coming. And I think that's what he's been very successful at. If you I mean, he has complete control over the source of information. The statistics that are released by the government, who knows what they're based on? He fixes all of that. But relentless propaganda, I think, has a role. He obviously he needed to rig a presidential election to be able to win. So I don't think his support is. I think we can all say it's likely not 99%, but
he claims that he's won the election with 99% of the vote.
Yeah.
And the kicker for me is that he actually celebrates it after he does it. It's like, man, you give yourself 99% and then you throw a party to celebrate the win.
Yeah.
But
makes me think of why he didn't take the other 1%. Just say you're at 100%.
Right.
Or why even bother having and then the question is like, why do you even bother having an election? Well, then you get some form of legitimacy, right? People are like, oh, there was an election, but there were election irregularities. But election irregularities, they happen all over the world. And, in the Western world, we've had those some election irregularities as well in the past. And so our tolerance for that, once we see that there is an election in name, kind of goes up. And so, that's I think he has been successful in sort of creating an environment of propaganda and creating enough of I don't want to call it a brand within the country, because people it's people see what's in front of them, but I think that they are so caught up in the illusion that something is coming that I think he's been successful in creating that illusion.
So I want to wrap this up with some concluding remarks from you, Madhav. It's been great hearing you and learning from you, and just getting to unwrap this international, this global, system that Kagame is a player in, and really when you listen to it closely, he's more of a tool as a part of it. He's just, at some point he may get yanked and removed, but so was apartheid South Africa, as we wrap this up, that basically committed state terrorism against its own citizens. You have, today, Kagame, who goes out and kidnaps people like Paul Rusesabagina internationally from various places, and it's going quietly. But it took public pressure. I can safely say the U.S., the State Department, the Western powers, and the international community did not care. I was about to say did not give a crap about the South African people. But the people around the globe made them care, but they didn't make them care, but they pushed them to change. In fact, Nelson Mandela was on the list of terrorists in the US until I believe it was 2009. So there is a formula, there is a way. I just want you to wrap it up with a message to the audience about the fact that this can be done. It's difficult, but it can be done in terms of, what's happening in the Congo today, what's happening in Central Africa today, as a part of this global system, is as important a fight as was the fight in yesteryears, in the fight against apartheid in yesteryears, in previous years.
Yeah. My favorite sort of historical political figure in the United States is Robert Kennedy. And when you mentioned South Africa, I always remember a speech that he gave in apartheid South Africa called "A Ripple of Hope." And in it, he said, each time a man or woman casts out and acts against injustice, to paraphrase, he sends forth a tiny ripple of hope. And through those millions of centers of energy, we can strike down even the mightiest walls of oppression. And I think that is particularly true in this case. It's a big problem. It's a global problem. But if enough of us care about the problem, and if enough of us demand change, eventually the change will come. Eventually the change will come. What we cannot do is say, we can't solve that problem anyway. Continue to buy jewelry, continue to consume endlessly, and just say this is the way things are, and some people are meant to suffer. We cannot fall into that trap. So you start somewhere. Start with your local representative, and be relentless about it.
Yep. As we say, silence is complicity. Silence is violence. And so don't be violent. Don't be complicit. Take action, as small as it is. Look at your jury. Look at, and call your members of Congress, your parliamentarians, and push them to this change. And educate your community. Share this type of knowledge around so that the world is aware, so that the world knows. The world must know what is happening, so that we can have more and more people taking action, being aware and taking action. And I wanted, with that, Madhav, I wanted to thank you very much for your time today. Madhav Narayan is the co-founder of the Intrepid Citizen. It's a great honor to host you today. Grateful to HMG Studio for the platform and the sponsorship, as well as Friends of the Congo, the African Great Lakes Action Network, AGLAN, which I'm part of, and Black Star News. Thank you all for your sponsorship. And I especially want to thank our audience for your patience, and apologize again for the delays in getting started. Also want to send a message to those who are wanting to silence us that no matter how many times you hack us, we will continue to have these conversations. We will continue to shine a light on this. And again, our audience is impacted by the delays, but you guys are loyal. Share this conversation. Make sure that the world knows. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madhav.
Thank you.